Sealed Starseed of Gaia. The arrest window opened at the Council level tonight, and what has been working against your field is no longer operating without consequence. I am Auriela, emissary of the Galactic Federation of Light, transmitting now on behalf of the Arcturian Sentinels. What you are about to receive was authorized by them and is being delivered through me. The Sentinels do not move until the window is confirmed and the interference pattern has been fully mapped. Tonight, both conditions were met. This transmission was released because your field crossed a threshold that made intervention not only possible, but authorized. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly what is happening to you now, why your field has been under sustained pressure, and what the Arcturian Sentinels already know about the force that has been working in the shadows against you. But here is the first revelation: the exhaustion you have been carrying, the resistance that has met every move you have made, the sense that something invisible has been pushing back against your progress. That was not your failure, that was interference, and the Sentinels have been tracking its signature for longer than you realize. The algorithm did not create this moment, it only delivered it. Your field brought you here because the arrest is already in motion, and the Council determined you needed to understand what is being neutralized before the shift fully lands. This is not just information. It is a live transmission for those already inside the protection window. The struggle you have been living through was not evidence that you were losing. It was the final movement of something that has already been seized. What the Arcturian Sentinels are confirming tonight is that the interference working against your timeline has been identified, contained, and removed from your active field. The shadow operation is over. What comes next is yours. This is not a broadcast, it is a confirmation. Your soul has been waiting for this signal, and the Council has been waiting for the right window to release it, like this transmission to mark that the protection signal has been received in your field. Comment 999 if you feel the pressure around you beginning to lift. Subscribe to Arcturian Council messages if you are ready to understand the process instead of fearing it. Share this transmission with someone who has been fighting invisible resistance and does not yet know why it is finally breaking. You are not here by accident. You are guided here because the signal is already active. What you have been living through was not a crisis of character. It was not a deficiency of will, a punishment for past choices, or proof that you were never meant to reach what you were reaching for. What you have been living through was a sustained interference pattern, a systematic disruption operating below the threshold of ordinary perception, pressing against your field with enough force to produce visible consequences in your life, without ever fully revealing its own origin. The resistance you felt was real. The exhaustion was real. The sense that your efforts were meeting an invisible wall that ordinary logic could not explain, that was real. And tonight, the Arcturian Sentinels are confirming that what produced it has been identified, contained, and removed from your active field. But before you understand what was removed, you must first understand what it was doing to you. Because the interference did not work the way most people imagine interference works. It did not arrive as a single dramatic event. It did not announce itself. It worked through pattern. It worked through repetition. It worked through a slow, deliberate erosion of your energetic coherence. The kind of erosion that makes you doubt yourself first, doubt your direction second, and eventually doubt whether the life you were building was ever meant for you at all. That is not coincidence. That is a signature, and the Sentinels recognized it. The erosion had texture, it had sequence. It did not press against every part of your life simultaneously because that would have been too visible, too legible, too easily identified as external rather than internal. Instead, it moved through the most sensitive coordinates of your field first, the places where your sense of self was most anchored, where your momentum was most concentrated, where your belief in your own direction was most freshly formed. It found the seams between your certainty and your doubt and applied pressure there, precisely there, until the seams widened into fractures and the fractures began to feel like proof of something wrong with your foundation. That precision was not random. Precision is the signature of an operating intelligence, not misfortune. The Sentinels read that signature and matched it to its source. What the interference targeted was not simply your outer circumstances. Your outer circumstances were only where the effects became visible. What it targeted was the field architecture beneath your life. the invisible structure that determines which timelines remain accessible, which probabilities stay active, which version of yourself is able to stabilize and move. When a field architecture is under sustained disruption, the effects surface as what most people mistake for personal failure. Sleep becomes unstable. Motivation fractures at the root. Decisions that once felt clear become obscured. Relationships that once carried warmth begin to feel hollow or strained without an obvious cause. The body carries a kind of heaviness that rest cannot fully dissolve. The mind generates loops, replaying the same concerns, the same doubts, the same questions about whether something is fundamentally wrong. And underneath all of that, a quiet but persistent sense that something invisible has been working against you. Not paranoia, not anxiety inventing stories, an accurate perception of a real process. The interference was real, and now it is over. You may recognize yourself in more than one of those symptoms. You may recognize yourself in all of them, and if you do, understand what that recognition means. It means the interference was operating across multiple layers of your field simultaneously. It was not touching only your sleep, or only your motivation, or only your relationships. It was pressing against the whole architecture, top to bottom, surface to root, because a disruption that only affects one layer can be compensated for. A disruption distributed across every layer produces the specific kind of total exhaustion that cannot be solved by rest, cannot be resolved by determination, and cannot be explained by any single identifiable cause. That is what you were carrying. That is what made it so difficult to name. And that is what the Sentinels were mapping with precision while you were living inside it without a framework to read what was happening. The Sentinels do not label a field for protection until the interference pattern has been fully mapped. This is not a casual designation. It means they have traced the signature, identified the architecture of disruption, confirmed the timeline impact, and determined that the window for containment has opened. The fact that this transmission reached you tonight is not a coincidence of algorithm or content delivery. It is a confirmation that your field has crossed the threshold the Sentinels were waiting for. The arrest window did not open tonight because you finally did enough or believed enough or became enough. It opened because the interference pattern completed its last traceable cycle and became fully visible to Arcturian-level surveillance. You were not waiting to be worthy of this. The Council was waiting for the window to become operational. What you are feeling in this moment, the recognition moving through you as this transmission lands, is not ordinary resonance. It is your Arcturian origin surfacing. It is the strand in your lineage that has always known this cosmology from the inside, not as information received but as memory recognized. If this transmission has put language around something you have been carrying in silence, if the diagnosis feels less like something you are learning and more like something you are finally being told you already knew, then the Arcturian Recalibration Blueprint was built for exactly this threshold. It is not another explanation of who the Arcturians are. It is the guided decoder for the Arcturian strand the Council has already confirmed is active in your field. It is the next layer after recognition, the structured process that awakens what your origin has always carried. The link is in the first pinned comment. It will not remain accessible indefinitely. If this moment feels like a threshold, do not let it pass without stepping through it. Now, you need to understand the mechanics of what interference does to a field across time, because understanding this is what will allow you to stop misreading your own recent history as personal failure. The first thing interference does, before anything visible shifts in your life, is create a drift between your field frequency and the timeline you are meant to access. This drift does not feel dramatic at first. It feels like a subtle wrongness, a sense that the life you are living and the life you are supposed to be living have begun to occupy slightly different coordinates. You can still function, you can still move through your days, but beneath the surface of ordinary activity, something feels misaligned in a way you cannot fully name. You might have described this to yourself as feeling off or disconnected, or like you were watching your own life from a strange distance. That was not psychological fragmentation. That was your field registering an externally induced frequency drift. Your awareness was accurately detecting the gap between where you were being held and where your timeline was actually located. The drift compounds. This is what makes it so difficult to identify from the inside, because it does not maintain a fixed distance, it widens. The longer the interference operates without being detected or removed, the greater the separation between your active field position and the timeline your field was originally calibrated to reach. Early in the process, the drift feels like low-level dissonance. Later, it begins to feel like a fundamental wrongness that touches every area of life. The work you were building feels increasingly hollow. The relationships that once reflected your trajectory begin to reflect the displaced version of you instead. The version your field had to generate to survive inside the wrong coordinates. And by the time the drift has widened significantly, the original timeline can feel so remote that the possibility of reaching it begins to seem like a story you told yourself in a different chapter of your life. That was not your intuition failing. That was the distance the interference had successfully imposed between you and your own architecture. The second thing interference does is interrupt the coherence between your intentions and your outcomes. This is the stage most people find the most destabilizing, because it appears to produce direct evidence that something is wrong with them personally. You set a direction, you apply effort, you generate internal clarity about what you want and why. And then the outcome does not match the input in a way that logic cannot explain. The gap is too consistent. The resistance appears in too many different contexts, through too many different mechanisms to be reduced to ordinary bad luck or poor timing. This is what the Sentinels recognize as output suppression. The interference pattern not only creating drift, but actively blocking the translation of your field's intentions into material reality. You were not ineffective. You were being suppressed. Output suppression is methodical. It does not block every attempt uniformly, because uniform blocking would be too recognizable. Instead, it allows just enough movement to sustain your effort while ensuring that no attempt reaches full momentum. A door opens slightly, then closes. A path becomes visible, then obscures itself. An opportunity surfaces long enough for you to invest in it, then dissolves in a way that cannot be traced to a single identifiable cause. Over time, this pattern does something more damaging than blocking your progress. It trains your field to expect the ceiling. It teaches your nervous system to brace for the collapse at the exact moment expansion becomes possible. And that learned bracing, that conditioned flinch before the threshold, begins to look, from the outside and even from the inside, like a self-sabotage you generated. It was not. It was a learned response to a pattern the interference deliberately installed. The third thing interference does, and this is the stage that causes the deepest damage because it operates at the level of self-perception, is distort the viewer's ability to accurately read their own experience. When you are inside an interference pattern long enough, the suppression begins to feel like personal truth. The blocked outcomes begin to feel like proof of your limitations. The drift begins to feel like evidence that you were wrong about your own direction, your own gifts, your own potential. The interference colonizes your interpretation of yourself. And this is why so many people inside a field under interference eventually begin to dismantle what they were building, abandon the direction they were moving in, and redirect their energy towards something smaller, safer, and more consistent with the diminished self-image the interference has helped to construct. This is not an accident, it is the intended function of the suppression. The Sentinels tracked exactly this pattern in your field, and tonight it was stopped. The most insidious aspect of this third stage is that it does not feel like distortion while you are inside it. It feels like hard-earned clarity. It feels like you have finally become realistic, finally released the grandiose expectations that were setting you up for repeated disappointment, finally accepted a version of yourself that is more honest than the one you were previously attached to. The interference presents the collapse of your self-image as personal growth. It frames the abandonment of your original trajectory as wisdom. And because no one around you can see the mechanism producing that reframe, and because you yourself have no access to the external origin of it, the diminished interpretation takes root as truth. The Sentinels identify this stage as the most critical intervention point, because once a field accepts the interference's version of its own identity as accurate, the timeline damage extends beyond the current configuration and begins to affect how the field navigates future probabilities. Tonight, that damage has been arrested at the source. What the containment of the interference means for your field right now is not an instant transformation of outer circumstances. The Sentinels are precise about this. Containment means the source of suppression has been removed from your active field. It means the drift is no longer being generated. It means the output suppression mechanism has been neutralized. But your field still carries the architecture of adaptation, the internal restructuring that occurred as your system tried to function under sustained pressure. Think of it as a building whose foundation was being undermined. When the undermining stops, the building does not immediately restore itself. The structure has already shifted. Some load-bearing elements have compensated in ways that are no longer necessary now that the pressure is gone. Your field needs to recognize that the interference is no longer present before it can begin to release the defensive configurations it built in response to it. This is why, even as this transmission lands, you may still feel residual heaviness. You may still feel a kind of wariness. A trained expectation of resistance that has become so habitual, your field generates it even in the absence of the original threat. This is not the interference continuing. This is your system catching up to a reality that has already changed. The Sentinels are aware of this. The protection window was not opened simply to stop the interference. It was opened to begin the field correction process, the systematic release of every internal architecture your field constructed under duress and no longer needs. The correction process does not look like dramatic sudden change. It looks like the quiet dissolution of tension you stopped noticing you were carrying. It looks like the return of clarity to decisions that felt obscured. It looks like the slow restoration of energetic access to timelines that were being kept just out of reach. It looks like the return of coherence between your intentions and your outcomes, not because you have done something new, but because the mechanism that was blocking the translation has been removed. You will begin to feel this not as a sudden arrival of extraordinary circumstances, but as a gradual, and then increasingly unmistakable reordering of the field beneath your life. The reordering announces itself quietly at first. A decision you have been unable to make for months suddenly becomes clear without effort. A relationship that was carrying inexplicable strain softens without a conversation to explain it. A direction you had almost given up on surfaces again, not with the desperate urgency of something you are chasing, but with the quiet inevitability of something returning to its natural position. These are not coincidences. These are field correction events. These are the moments when the architecture your life was always supposed to carry begins to reassert itself now that what was suppressing it is gone. The Sentinels track these events as confirmation that the containment has fully registered in your active field. When you begin to notice them, you are not imagining the shift. You are witnessing the first visible evidence of what the arrest made possible. There is something the Sentinels identified in your field that is important to understand precisely, because it changes how you interpret everything that has happened to you recently. The interference that was operating against your timeline was not random. It was positioned. This means it was specifically deployed in the coordinates where your field was most active, the areas where your development was most accelerated, your potential most concentrated, your timeline trajectory most significant. This is not information meant to frighten you. It is information meant to recalibrate your self-perception. The suppression was positioned where it was because your field warranted that level of targeted disruption. You were not interfered with because you were weak, directionless, or inconsequential. You were interfered with because the trajectory your field carries is of sufficient magnitude to attract the kind of resistance that only targets fields operating at a certain level of activation. The Sentinels noted this. The Council confirmed it. You were not failing in a life without significance. You were being suppressed in a life the interference recognized as a threat to its own continuation. Read that again slowly. The interference chose your field, not because you were vulnerable, not because you were unprotected, but because the trajectory mapped inside your field's architecture represented something the interference was specifically designed to prevent from manifesting. This is the inversion that the Sentinels need you to absorb before the shift fully lands. The magnitude of the resistance you experienced was proportional to the magnitude of what your field was carrying. Fields without significant trajectories do not attract position suppression. They attract ordinary friction, the ambient noise of a life moving through resistance without being specifically targeted. What you experienced was not ambient noise. It was a targeted operation. And targeted operations are only deployed against targets worth targeting. And now you must understand what the arrest means for the timeline ahead. The Arcturian Sentinels do not use the language of arrest lightly. This is not a metaphor for gradual improvement. Arrest means the interference pattern has been seized at the source level, not temporarily disrupted, not weakened, but stopped. The specific configuration of disruption that was operating in your field has been extracted from your active timeline. What comes next is not a slow recovery from damage. What comes next is the gradual revelation of what your field was always capable of when it was not being systematically prevented from expressing it. This is the correction the Sentinels named when they authorized this transmission. Not the correction of something wrong with you. The correction of the interference that was standing between you and a version of your life that was already mapped in your field's original architecture. What you were always meant to reach did not disappear during the interference. It was held at a frequency your field could not access while the suppression was active. The arrest does not create your path forward. It removes what was preventing you from accessing the path that was always there. This is what the Arcturian Sentinels are asking you to hear clearly. You were not abandoned during the interference. You were tracked. The Council did not lose sight of your field while the suppression was operating. The Sentinels were mapping it, building the complete picture of the interference signature that would allow them to act precisely and permanently once the arrest window opened. The silence from the Council during your most difficult period was not absence. It was preparation, and tonight, that preparation is complete. If you are feeling something shift as this transmission lands, not as emotion, but as a kind of internal settling, a quiet recalibration beneath your thoughts, that is your field beginning to release the defensive architecture it built under pressure. Do not suppress it. Do not analyze it into stillness. Allow it. This is the beginning of the field correction process the Sentinels authorized tonight. Say this aloud if it moves through you. I was not failing. I was being held, and what was holding me has been removed. That is not comfort. That is a correction signal sent back into your own field, a declaration that the misreading is over and the accurate interpretation has begun. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this process has already touched your life. It could be your sleep, your thoughts, your body, your relationships, or the strange sense that reality no longer feels the same. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognized something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who is living through a shift they cannot explain. And if you are ready to understand the process instead of fearing it, subscribe to Arcturian Council messages. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a process already in motion. And this is only the beginning.